Hey there, nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back with an episode of Cheap Shots. And on today's episode, we're going to show you guys how to quickly and, more importantly, cheaply paint up a unit of Myari's Purifiers, which is a warband from Warhammer Underworlds, very popular lineup. And we'll be painting these guys up to a beautiful tabletop standard. As you can see, this will be the end result of what your miniatures will look like. And if you use the techniques as well as the materials that we recommend in this video, you're talking about a grand total investment of $31.37 in order to paint up this entire squad to look exactly like this. And that's assuming, of course, you're purchasing all the materials for the very first time. Now, when you compare that to the materials you purchase from our painter as well as Games Workshop, you're talking about a grand total investment of $190.70. And when you compare that with our Cheapskate method, we're saving you $159.33. So that being said, let's go ahead and talk about exactly how to paint up Myari's Purifiers for your games of Warhammer Underworld. Alright, so the very first step you need to do, of course, is assemble your miniatures, which is pretty easy to do with these guys since they are Underworld miniatures made by Warhammer. They're just push-fits construction, so you just assemble your miniatures very quickly, and then from there, of course, you need to prime your miniatures. Now, when it comes to priming your miniatures, it's actually a very important step because it allows a surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. If you were to paint your miniatures on bare plastic, what ends up happening is that the surface tension on that bare plastic isn't enough for your acrylic paints to adhere to, so because of that, the slightest amount of friction will rub off and, of course, ruin your finish. So because that, you need to do a primer for this one. In this case, I use Rust-Oleum Flat White Primer. I get this in my local Walmart for about $3.99, and I just do it once over. I do apologize, I have a little bit of a cold while I'm doing this video. And so because of that, once you do the once over, then your miniature is fully set to go for your painting. Now, traditionally speaking, when it comes to primers, most people choose one of three colors for their primers. They either use white, like I've done in this example, or gray, or black. And the reason why is because depending on the undercoat you're using for your priming could have a huge impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you use on your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, the more bright and colorful your miniatures are, you want to use a white primer, whereas the more dark or metallic your paint scheme, the more towards black you want to go as well. Now, because we're doing a quick paint method, we'll be using oil wash on this one, which will mute down the vibrancy of the colors that we're using, so I'm going with a white undercoat. And at the same time, if you notice, my paint scheme for this unit is a little bit different than the box art, and the reason why is because I'm not actually using this unit for Warhammer Underworlds. I could easily do that without a problem, but what I'm using these guys for is to create the core of a Shadow Warriors Warband for Mordheim. So because I'm going with more of a darker gray, darker blue kind of paint scheme with these miniatures. So once you're done with priming, the first thing we do now is work on the flesh of these miniatures. Now, luckily for us, not a lot of skin is actually showing on these guys. Pretty much just their faces and their hands are the only part of flesh that's exposed on these guys. So it's really simple. All I do is I put 2 thin coats of Apple Barrel's flesh colored paint. I get this in my local Walmart for about 50 cents. I just put 2 thin coats of that to do a base coat. And then from there, of course, I do a dry brush using Delta's Serum Coats, Peaches and Cream. I get this in my local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. Just do a quick dry brushing with that. And what the dry brushing does is that it allows the pigment of the paint to capture upon the raised surfaces of the miniature, which creates the illusion of depth. So you're creating highlights with that dry brushing technique while leaving that darker color in the recesses, adding that illusion of depth to your miniatures. And once you guys are done with that, next thing you do now is start working on the uniforms. So the main thing we're working on these guys real quick is the fabric on these miniatures, and to add a little bit of diversity of color amongst these guys, I pretty much divide them in half, painting one half of the squad with sky blue for their pants as well as for their jackets, kind of give like this soft kind of light bluish color for their clothing. And for the other half of the squad, I decided to paint up their clothing in mermaid blue by Delta Serum Coat. Cost 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby, while the sky blue will cost 50 cents at your local Walmart. Just put 2 thin coats on the parts of the uniform that you want to be that bluish color, and once you're done with that, time to work on the cloaks. Now, a really important feature on these miniatures are the cloaks and these giant overcoats that they wear for their miniatures as well. So because of that, since I'm going with like a darker color scheme, because these guys are supposed to be members of a Shadow Warriors Warband from Mordheim, I use Skyline by Folk Art. It's a beautiful grayish blue color that I use. I get this on my local Walmart for about 75 cents. I just put 2 thin layers on the overcoats as well as the cloaks. I want to be this beautiful grayish blue color. I just put 2 thin coats, let it dry, and then from there, of course, I'm ready for a dry brush. So regardless of whatever blue color I use for these miniatures on their clothing as well as for the overcloaks, I'm going to do a overall dry brush all over all the blue fabric that I've done so far with Adidas acrylic slate blue. I get this in my local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. It's a nice slate blue color, kind of like a lighter grayish with a little bit of tinge of a blue. It's a beautiful color to use for to do dry brushing with. And as you can see, I just do a quick dry brushing real quick all over the folds of the fabric. That way the slate blue catches upon the raised surfaces of the folds while keeping those darker colors and recesses, and once again adding that illusion of depth. Now if you'll notice, my miniatures actually have a very chalky kind of pastel finish so far, and that's because of the dry brushing that we're using. Now I know it may look kind of weird at first, but trust me when I say this, when we get to the oil washing phase, that transition as well as that pastel kind of look is going to fade away because our layers of color and dry brushing and base coating will then blend together with the oil washing phase. It's going to bring it all together. So even though it looks kind of funky, believe me, it's going to work. Trust the process. You're doing okay. So the next step, of course, is to do the leather goods. And as you can see right there on the left-hand side, you can kind of see the little Shadow Warriors Warband I'm painting at exactly the same time painting these guys as well. So for the leathers of these guys, these are things like gloves, for example, boots, scabbards as well. I just picked those out of 2 thin layers of Burnt Umber by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a beautiful dark brown color. I get this from my local Walmart for about 50 cents. So once I find those leather goods and I want to be brown, I just do 2 thin coats of that because it's a nice contrast to all the blues that we're using. And once we are done with the base coating for the leather, we have to once again dry brush that. In this case, I use Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel Paint. Costs 50 cents at my local Walmart. Just do a quick dry brushing all over all the leather goods that we painted earlier in Burnt Umber, just to add that extra detail and highlighting as well as that create that illusion of depth on the miniatures as well. And now that we're done with that, we're pretty much done with most of the clothing on these guys. Start to focusing now on the smaller details. So to work on some of the smaller details, things that we're focusing on, for example, are the weapon grips for the most part. So for example, if you look on the fighter on the left-hand side, they have a back pole with a banner on it. You have a wizard right there in the middle of the table as well. Another guy armor carrying a huge warhammer. Another character carrying a large compound bow. And so because I decided to paint those up with a traditional wooden color, I decided to use Taupe Gray by Anita's Acrylic. It runs about 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. I just put 2 thin coats on that. It kind of gives this kind of mystical, magical, elven, pale khaki color. You see this quite a bit in elven architecture for miniatures as well as in weapons and stuff. You see this quite a bit for Wraithbone, I believe is what it's called, for 40k for the Eldar. It's this idea that they're using this magical bone and substance in order to make most of their day-to-day materials instead of using wood. And so that's a nice color to use. I just put 2 thin coats of that color on the parts that I want to have that grayish pale color for all the weapon grips. And then from there, of course, we'll work on our next series of details. One of the cool things about these miniatures is that each of these miniatures carry backpacks. You get this idea that these guys are not just, adventurers, that they're actually going in there and planning on spending some time there as well, and they bring gear with them, like they're actually adventuring and actually exploring and stuff, which I thought was kind of cool. So because if you look on the backpacks, these guys have actually got quite a bit of detail on their backpacks. They have looks like bedrolls for them to actually have in their bags as well as things like scrolls and bottles and all kinds of stuff. So for those sleeping rolls that they have attached to their backpacks, I just picked out 2 thin layers of my Mocha by Apple Barrel Paint. I get this stuff at my local Walmart for about 50 cents. Just put 2 thin layers of that for the sleeping rolls, and then from there we're ready to work on our next minor detail. So the next thing we're going to work on is on the owl that's perched on Myari's forearm right over there. So what I decided to do is do a base coat of Folk Arts Burnt Sienna, which costs you about 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. Just put 2 thin coats on that to create the base coat for the little owl creature there. And then from there, of course, I did a couple of dry brushes. First of all, I did a dry brush with the khaki paint by Apple Barrel Paint, cost 50 cents, as well as Dartel Coat, Serum Coats, Drizzle Gray, which costs you about 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. What I did is I picked out the little talons on the feet with that guy in the khaki, and then I did a dry brush real quick with the Drizzle Gray all over the owl miniature, so that way it has a little bit more depth. It also creates that texturing as well. So from there we start focusing on the finer details in the miniature as well with Bright Blue by Apple Barrel Paint, costing 50 cents at your local Walmart. These are things like little armor panels that are on the overcoats as well as the strings of the compound bow, the sashes these guys are wearing as well as the back bow panner as well. Just put 2 thin layers of that Bright Blue, and then from there we move on to our next dry brush. So the articles of clothing I just did in Bright Blue, I did dry brush real fast with Sky Blue by Apple Barrel Paint. It's the same color we used earlier. And then we start working on the bases. So the bases that these guys are standing on are supposed to be like these sculpted kind of Zen Garden inspired rocks that these guys are standing on, because these guys are Lumineth Realm-Lords, which are basically Age of Sigmar's version of High Elves. I'm not sure why they said stick with high elves, but whatever. So because I just put 2 thin layers of Granite Gray by Apple paint, costing 50 cents at my local Hobby Lobby. Now you'll notice some of the white base coat and undercoating is going to peek through a little bit on that one. That's perfectly fine if it does, because we're going to dry brush this light gray anyway, so it's going to look like it's part of the dry brushing, so no harm, no foul. And since we got most of the minor details done, these guys, next thing we're working on real quick are the metallic elements. Alright, so the next thing we're working on are the metallic elements. So for the metallic elements on these miniatures, which are quite extensive, I use 3 colors primarily. All made, 2 of them are made by Folk Art, another one made by Deco Art. For Folk Art, I use Copper by Folk Art, as well as Gunmetal Gray from Folk Art. Those cost 75 cents at your local Walmart, and as well as Deco Art's and Pure Emperor Gold for all the gold elements. I got them at my local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. And as you can see here, I just paint up all the metallic elements that I want to be painted up. For the most part, for all the parts are done in silver, I paint up with Gunmetal Gray. For all the parts are done in copper, I put 2 thin coats of Copper by Folk Art, and all the parts are golden. I put 2 thin coats of Emperor's Gold by Deco Art, and as you can see, it looks absolutely stunning with the way this paint job is done. A lot of these guys actually have like these like runic symbols on their armor panels, so what I would do is I would paint the armor panel entirely in Gunmetal Gray, and then I'll pick out those details in either Copper or Emperor's Gold, depending on the situation and what I thought looked cool at that time. So for example, if you look at the archer on the right hand side, he's got like these flame emblems on his armor, so I paint that chest piece silver and pick out those flame elements in gold. At the same time, for the swords on the left-hand side, that person's got a silver-bladed sword with some copper runes carved directly into the blade. For the guy who's got the giant warhammer, he's got a huge helmeted crest, so I made the bull helmet on that look gold, with most of the helmet looking silver. So you just kind of basically got to go through and alternate and pick out those details and determine what colors you want to use for them. My suggestion to you, if you're a novice painter, is to paint all the metallic elements silver first, and then pick out those details in either gold or copper in order to break up the monotony. So once you're done with all the metallic elements, we're going to need to work on our final little details. So there are a couple of fine little details that we're picking out these guys. For example, these guys do have some gemstones on their armor, as well as some bottles that they're also carrying on their bags, as well as some other design elements. So for the parts for the bottles, I painted those in 2 thin layers of Holly Branch by Apple paint. For the parts for like the gemstones scattered throughout the armor, especially the gold and the silver parts, I picked out 2 thin layers of Mermaid Blue just for those additional things. So like the little eye on the top of the back banner pole for the swordsman, as well as the hilt of their sword, for the eyes of the bull, for example. And probably the most important color I used was the bright magenta by Apple paint. It costs about 50 cents at your local Walmart, and those are things like feathers. They have like little glass vials and jewels and beads all over their armor, as well as for the quiver and the feathers on the quiver of arrows. I just picked those out in 2 thin layers of bright magenta because I thought it contrasted very nicely with the blues and the grays on these miniatures, and it really pops and also helps stick out. So find those little details and pick those out. So now that we're done with the actual miniatures themselves, time to focus on the bases. So in this case, for the bases, because they're standing on those stones, I dry brush the base in a thin layer of Pale Gray by Folk Art. It costs you 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby, and is a really rough dry brushing all over the rocks to kind of give you that illusion of depth, as well as weathering, as well as a little bit of a pale granite kind of look for these standing stones these guys are standing upon. And some of the finer details on the bases we also picked out as well. So we have like these bonsai tree looking things coming out of the rocks, as well as some grass tufts as well. So for the trunks of the bonsai trees, I put 2 thin layers of Moccasin Brown by Nia's Acrylic. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. Now for the tufts of grass, I used 2 thin layers of Palm Leaf by Apple Barrel Paint. That costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. And for the canopies of the bonsai trees, I picked out 2 thin layers of Holly Branch by Apple Barrel Paint. And that costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart as well. So once you guys are done picking out those layers, next thing you gotta do, of course, is a dry brush. So the very final process we go through before we go through the oil wash stage is to dry brush all the shrubbery that's on the bases of these guys, so the leaves of the bonsai trees, as well as a tuft of grass. I just used 1 simple layer of lime sherbet by Apple Barrel Paint. Costs 50 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. Just a quick dry brush on that to create that illusion of depth and create highlights on those tufts of vegetation on the bases. And we are pretty much done with these miniatures. So the next step, of course, to do is an oil wash. So the oil wash is the magical recipe ingredient for this painting process. It is a quick paint method, and when you do an oil wash, you just take a singular wash, you put it all over the miniature to do your single unifying wash. Now in this case, a lot of people like to either use Army Painter Strong Tone or Army Painter Soft Tone in order to do this step. And there's nothing wrong with those products that do exactly as advertised. The only problem is that they cost $32 a can, while a can of Midwax poly shades in Mission Oak color. Does exactly the same thing, but only costs $6.99, and that's exactly what I use on these miniatures. I just mix up the poly shade acrylic and I just paint it all over these guys like a wash and let it seep into all the fine details. So you apply it like a wash all over the miniature, and what it ends up having is the Mission Oak does a couple of things. The first thing it does, it creeps into the recesses of the miniatures, bring out a lot of those details that we didn't see before. So the individual folds of the clothing, for example, the space between the fingers and the features of the face, and the individual branches of the tufts of vegetation on their bases, the texturing all over the miniatures, as well as in the rock formations. So it's a beautiful job of bringing out those details. Another thing it also does as well is it also smooths out the transitions between our base coats and our dry brushes. If you'll notice, that pastel kind of rough looking texture is now gone because those transitions have been smoothed over by the oil wash and blending those together. And the last thing it does, of course, as well, is it darkens down the vibrancy of the colors that we use in these miniatures. As you can see, they're not as brightly colored as they were before. And that's the reason why we went with the bright colors that we did in the first place, because the oil wash is going to darken them down as well. Now, once you get done with the oil washing phase, you got to let these miniatures sit and dry and cure for about 24 hours. And the reason why is because the Mission Oak Polyshade does have polyurethane in it, so it's going to create a nice airtight seal to protect the paint job in your miniatures. And at the same time, you want to let that stuff dry and cure, because if you handle these miniatures while they're still kind of tacky or they're still kind of not dry all the way, you could destroy the finishing miniature by removing some of the paint by handling it. And I know this from experience because I've done that before. So just do this as the very last stage of when you usually paint. Whenever you paint, use as your very last step, and then leave it to dry and cure until you come back to paint them again. And that's how I recommend you do it. Alright, so once you let these miniatures dry and cure, the next thing you do, of course, is a matte varnish. This part is completely optional, but I like using the matte finish on these guys because I'm not a big fan of that candy-coated shine that's left on the polyurethane. If you do like that, you can, of course, skip this next step, but me, personally, I like that muted look, so that's what I used. I use a can of Krylon matte varnish that I get at my local Walmart for about $5.99. Just give these guys a once-over to mute down the sheen of that miniature so that we can see a lot of the details are being hidden away earlier from the shininess from that polyurethane coating. Now, once you're done with that, the last thing I gotta do, of course, is to rim the bases. In this case, I use 3 thin layers of palm leaf or apple barrel paint. Just do it 3 times, the 3 base coats to make sure it's a strong, vibrant green color. And then once you're done with that, you're pretty much finished with these miniatures. And here's a close-up from the title slide that we saw earlier of these guys standing up on a field of battle. So as you can see, they look absolutely fantastic with a beautiful tabletop finish as well. Ready to take these guys out into either the underbelly of Warhammer Underworlds to fight for the glory of the Age of Sigmar, or bring them out into the tabletop for Mordheim, like I'm going to use these guys for Shadow Warriors. So I'm looking forward to exactly see what these guys can do. So now that we're done talking about exactly how we went about painting these miniatures, let's go and talk about the shopping list that you need to acquire from Army Painter and Citadel, or paint your miniatures up exactly the same we did, except using those name brand paints. So we'll be right back after this. Alright, so this is the shopping list that you'll need to purchase from Citadel as well as Army Painter to have your miniatures look exactly like ours. You need exactly the same technique that we did. So first of all, you need to buy Corax White Spray, which is going to cost us $17, as well as Bane Brain Brown, Militarm Green, Teclis Blue, Caliban Green, Screamer Pink, Cyberite Green, Blue Horror. All those are going to cost you $4.55. You also need to buy a Pot of Wildwood, which is going to cost you $7.08 for that. You also need to purchase Cadian Fleshtone, Morghast Bone, Baylor Brown, Slanesh Gray, Flayed One Flesh, Baharoth Blue, Ulthuan Gray, Fenrisian Gray, XV88, Rakarth Flesh, all those costing $4.55 as well. Now, for your metallic colors, you need to buy Lead Belch as well as Screaming Bell. This costs you $7.80 for those. You'll also need to buy a Pot of Rust Gray for $4.55, as well as Doom Bull Brown for $4.55. You also need to buy a Pot of Retributor Armor for $7.80, as well as Army Painter Strong Tone for $32, and Munitorium Varnish for $19.50 if you plan on doing the matte finish on this as well. Now, assuming you're purchasing everything from Citadel as well as Army Painter for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $190.70 in order to paint up your miniatures using the same techniques and ideas that we did using our Cheapskate method. Now, if you take that total of $190.70 and you subtract the Cheapskate grand total, which is $31.37, you're talking about a grand total savings of $159.33 on our paint your miniatures, just like we did, except using cheap craft paints instead. So there you guys have it. That's an example of how you guys can paint up Myari's Purifiers using some cheap craft paints and having a beautiful result at the end of it. That's good to do for this week, guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good to do for this week, guys. We'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.